9 Points of the Law by Thomas Grant Springer. This is recorded to celebrate the 9th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wilson stepped into the dingy restaurant and stood a moment, dripping like a wet terrier on the mat. Then he slopped apologetically across the freshly mopped oilcloth, marking his progress with muddy footprints, and slid softly into a chair at a table against the wall. The grey gloom of the out-of-doors seemed to penetrate even here, and to intensify the vain regret that was the aftermath of a lurid evening. The waitress rose from behind her barricade of smeared mustard pots with a thievish air, swung languidly up the aisle with an exaggerated kangaroo gait, stopping to adjust her frowsy coiffure before the mirror over the counter, then selected his table instruments with provoking deliberation. Returning, she set them before him, never an enlivening smile warming the cool insolence of her face, as she masticated her gum with a regular rotary motion of her jaw, and gazed with calm gloom far over his head into the rain-soaked vista of the street. His eyes searched her face with the mute appeal of a whipped dog. Then he gave his order in a tone that apologized for his existence, and drained his glass of water in huge gulps, grateful for the momentary moisture in his hot throat. The dampness of his coat seemed to soak into his spirits, and his mind began to speculate vaguely as to the whereabouts of his umbrella, hung no doubt on some bar rail, to be lifted by a thankful stranger hand. Seeking to alleviate his sense of hopeless loss, his eyes began to roam idly about the room. The late breakfasters had gone, and the vanguard of lunch patrons was still an hour off. The only other occupant of the room, aside from the dozing cashier at the counter, was a seedy individual at the next table, consuming lumpy mush in noisy mouthfuls. Wilson turned from the sickening spectacle with a sense of disgust, when his eyes encountered an umbrella standing against the wall between his table and the next, but slightly nearer his. It was a beautiful umbrella. From its surmounting oxidized silver handle, down its glittering, rain-shimmering silken folds, to its aristocratic steel-tipped point, it bespoke a fashionable smartness that absolutely prohibited in Wilson's mind its ownership with the shabby mush consumer. Wilson's eyes glued themselves upon it with fatal fascination, to be withdrawn in guilty haste as the girl arrived with his order. He immediately devoted himself to the food with an attention too palpably assumed. The girl returned to her occupying mustard pots, Wilson's eyes following her with criminal fear of her having read his thoughts. But the insolent blankness of her face reassured him. His mind became absorbed in the problem of possession. If by any accident of chance the object of desire should belong to his neighbour, he had no excuse in the matter of a substitute to fall back on, should he be discovered in his acquisition of the property. Clearly there was but one thing to do: allow his neighbour to finish his meal and pass out, then carelessly appropriate the umbrella with all the nonchalant assumption of ownership, and stroll to the street with preoccupied abstraction. He ceased his violent and somewhat nauseating haste with his eggs, which, owing to his throat feeling like plush, had to be pushed down, leaving a stickiness behind, and began to kill time against his neighbour's departure. Then he noticed with growing apprehension that the man had finished, but was still sitting there with an air of nervous abstraction, now and then casting covetous eyes at the umbrella. A horror of doubt assailed Wilson. Could it be that his neighbour was bitten by the same guilty longing? He forced his mind to be calm and study it out. The stranger's shabby shoulders were dumb. Glancing up to the hook above his head, Wilson could see that his dingy derby was shining with moisture. The result of Wilson's deductions was that the stranger had entered without an umbrella. A further study, noting the furtive glances the man cast behind him, the nervous assumption of leisure, the too apparent absorption in the morning paper, convinced Wilson that he did not intend to leave without one. Wilson flushed at the cool insolence of the fellow. He would rise, take the umbrella, and saunter carelessly to the counter, turning a moment to enjoy the blank disappointment on his neighbour's face. Then he stopped suddenly. The other man was there first. Suppose he had noticed it before Wilson entered. How could he then explain his assumption of possession of it if questioned? Ah, he was nervous. No doubt the stranger had not seen it, and Wilson merely imagined the other's desire to possess it, stimulated by his own guilt. He picked up the paper and began a desultory perusal, casting occasional glances over it at his neighbour's shoulders, and growing more impatient as he lingered. The girl finished the mustard pots, came over and cleared his table, then that of his neighbour. Wilson heaved a sigh of relief. Surely now the fellow would go. But no, he showed no disposition to do so. Wilson's jaw set with determination. Clearly it was to be a trial of endurance. Very well, he could wait as long as the other. He salved his conscience with the excuse of discovery. The other man grew nervous, and Wilson smiled grimly as he heard the paper rattle. He glanced up and caught the waitress eyeing them with what seemed to him an amused smile. Did she too know, and was she enjoying the uneasiness of both? He looked up at the clock and saw that he had been there almost an hour, and that it was nearly time for the lunch patrons to arrive. Would the fellow never go? His very lingering convinced Wilson that the umbrella was not his. Then he, Wilson, had quite as much right to it as the other. Yes, and he meant to have it too. Just then a well-dressed, nervous old gentleman entered. "Did I leave my umbrella here?" he asked the cashier. "I ain't seen it," she replied indifferently. "It was a silk umbrella with an oxidized silver handle," he went on. "I ate breakfast here, and then stepped across the street to Dr. Black's office. I must have left it here, for I've been nowhere else. I sat right there. Why, bless me, there it is." And he rushed nervously down the aisle, snatched it, and with a beaming face hastened out, pausing at the door to raise it. Wilson waited a moment, then, with a sickening sense of loss, rose, his neighbour almost simultaneously following his example. They paused together at the counter, then shot a sheepish, sidelong glance at each other. At the door they drew their coat collars about their throats and hurried in opposite directions through the downpour. End of 9 Points of the Law by Thomas Grant Springer.